I'm Nita Tamarkin. I direct Russian Area Studies, and I'm a colleague in the History Department. And we have invited Professor Ronald Suny, who is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan Emeritus and Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. Before that, he taught Russian and Caucasian history at Oberlin for over a dozen years, for a total of, are you ready? 55 years of teaching the history of our turbulent region. Professor Suny is the most distinguished and certainly most prolific historian of the Soviet Union in the US, and more important, the most beloved. Because he's such a warm, generous, and wonderful human being, which I can attest to after over 40 years of close friendship and collegiality. He's written so many important books on Russia and the Caucasus over the past half century that I'll mention only the most recent. Stalin, Passage to Revolution, which he published after, 30 years of working on, always Stalin's last victim, right? Russia's Empires, co-authored with Val Kivelson, which my students read part of in two of my courses. Red Flag Unfurled, Historians, the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Experiment. Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment. He was elected president of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies in 2005, and in 2013 was given the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies Distinguished Contributions to Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies award. He's a prize winner. An Armenian who has embraced Turkish language and culture, a Marxist who in 2021 was awarded the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize. The book, the Stalin book was, right?
Absolutely.
For the book which in the past year, quote, exemplifies the best and most innovative new writing in or about the Marxist tradition. But who, however, as a Marxist, has not been able to convince the Oxford University Press to price his Soviet history textbook so that my students use at a level affordable by the working proletariat. I give you Professor Ronald Suny for a lecture called Imperial Overreach, Putin, Russia, and Empire. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to lower the price for the proletariat when the American proletariat is voting for Trump. So, so that's part of the problem. Anyway, thank you all for coming. It's the middle of the night, as far as I can tell, and yet you came out on this beautiful evening.
Can you all hear the
this
mic?
talk. Yeah, let me know if you can hear, wave or something. This is an auspicious moment we're living in. It's not a pleasant one, and a lot of my students, and probably students here as well, are in despair, or at least are becoming more pessimistic about the future. And of course I worry about that, because in my view pessimism leads to the right and optimism to the left. And so we need to think about the world that we're living in, try to understand it, and maybe find some ways out and beyond. And you're all very young, most of you, and therefore I'm going to try to leave you with some hope at the end. But as an Armenian American born in Philadelphia, and thinking about what happened to Armenia in the last weeks, that is the physical elimination, the ethnic cleansing of about 120,000 Armenians from an area called Nagorno-Karabakh, Mountainous Karabakh, which had been an enclave within Azerbaijan, thinking about the horrific war in Ukraine, the result of Putin's invasion a little over a year ago, the war crimes that have followed there, as well as in Armenia. Ethnic cleansing is a war crime. The kinds of atrocities we've seen in Ukraine are war crimes. And now the war that's going on after the incursion of Hamas into Israel proper, and the killing, quite arbitrary killing of Israeli citizens by this Palestinian group. So all of these things together, and now the Israeli bombing of what is essentially an open-air prison, Gaza, from the air. And I believe that aerial bombing of urban conglomerates of people is also a war crime. So imagine this, we're living in an age of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of ethnic cleansing, and the word genocide, something I've written about quite a bit, is used a little bit too promiscuously, a little bit too loosely to describe these terrible events. So we're looking for ways to understand. And today, I want to talk about mostly, though I'll refer to these other things as well, the war in Ukraine, and try to understand what Putin and the Russians are about. Let me give you a small, short genealogy of this talk. I, a person on the left, Nina made sure to mention that I'm a Marxist, whatever that is, and we may understand very different things by that. I was at a dinner party recently at the American Academy in Berlin, and the woman next to me said, "Oh, do you know that his nephew is a Marxist?" And I said, "Well, what kind of Marxist?" "Oh," she said, "there are different kinds." I said, "Well, Stalin was a Marxist, and Trotsky was a Marxist, and they didn't like each other and fought, and Stalin had Trotsky killed, and then there are social democrats who wouldn't have liked any of them, and there are a whole variety of them." So if you want to know what kind of Marxism, just write to me and I'll send you an article I wrote called Capitalism and the Common Good, What's Left of Marx, meaning what remains of Marx worth using, and what is to the left of Marx, what can be more participatory, democratic, and socially just. Okay, but if I turn to Ukraine, I am worried about some of the effects of the way we've been thinking about this horrendous war that Putin began a year ago. There are different discourses, different ways of understanding, different universals of meaning that are swirling around this invasion and the horrors that have followed. There is, of course, and I think most people in this room would probably agree, no excuse for what the Russians have done. No rationale. And even wise Russians, and the hundreds of thousands who have fled from Ukraine, have come to realize, and maybe even Putin has realized, what a blunder he has engaged Russia in. And then, of course, on the other side, there's the Ukrainians' own desperate and heroic resistance to this aggression. Among scholars and pundits and governments and commenters, there's a great divide about how we are to understand this event. And many argue at the moment against any call for a ceasefire or engagement in negotiations. And they see this idea that there might be a way out as somehow making equivalent Ukraine's morally justified self-defense and Russia's unprovoked aggression. So to bolster arguments, scholars, quite distinguished scholars, now sort of public intellectuals, have proposed their own reading of the motivations of Putin. And they argue that the way Putin is thinking is related to and influenced by the Eurasian fantasies of people like Alexander Dugin or the fascism of Ivan Ilyin. More broadly, commenters have generally been dismissive of what in international relations theory is called realism. These realist accounts offered by international relations scholars, particularly those of my former colleague at Chicago, John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer is very prominent. He's now considered, quite notorious. And he himself describes himself as an offensive realist. He's not personally offensive, but that particular aggressive form of realism is what he means. And people like Mearsheimer are condemned as amoral, if not immoral. And it's understandable that Ukrainians are understood to be, by many, to be fighting and dying, not simply for themselves, but not only for Ukraine, their homeland, but by extension in the dominant Western and Ukrainian discourses for Europe, democracy, and civilization itself. So this conflict has now been elevated to a kind of moral, political, existential struggle about different ways of imagining the future. And in the same constellation of thinking, by implication, any Russians who support this war of aggression, whether faithful or patriotic or deceived or self-deluded, are seen to be fighting for a regime that is autocratic, imperialist, kleptocratic, expansionist, and an existential threat to the values of civilization and the West. So what I'm trying to say is that there are two narratives. And when you do this kind of narrative bifurcation, you always are simplifying. But I think this captures a lot of what's going on. There's a deep divide which doesn't concede any truth to the other. Now, the one you're probably most familiar with, which is more widespread and familiar in the West, particularly in the United States, is the view that, first of all, Russia is and always was an expansionist state. And its current president, Vladimir Putin, is the embodiment of an essential Russian imperial ambition. Putin wants to build a new Russian empire that is, in Vladimir Vladimirovich's mind, to restore the former Soviet Union. So this is this narrative. And in this narrative, it is not Russia's national interests that are the driving factors, but the personal fantasies of Putin and his closest cronies. Therefore, if you want to understand what happened and why Russia invaded Ukraine, you're reduced to psychologizing or even psychoanalyzing Putin. Such a view has most recently been expressed not only by Russophobic pundits and politicians, but after the Russian invasion by President Joe Biden himself, and I quote, "Now the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption," unquote. Left out of this Western narrative, and particularly in its American form, is any sense or concession that the West may be part of the problem, particularly the drive to expand NATO eastward, deep into what Russia considers its sphere of influence. So it's a very much a view that one side is totally responsible for what's happened, and the other side is a benign, neutral onlooker. Let's start with this idea of NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was originally formed in 1949, and you note that it was an alliance of powers in Europe and North America against the Soviet Union, deliberately formed outside the frame of the United Nations, which originally had been formed during the war, when the Soviet Union was an ally of the West and the largest contributor to the defeat of fascism in Europe. And it was an alternative to that. And in the view of Soviet strategists, this formation of NATO contradicted the international order set up 4 years earlier at the end of the war. NATO appeared for a while after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact to, you might remember this, oh, you probably was far too young, but anyway, I can remember it because I'm very old, appeared to have lost its raison d'etre. Why do you need NATO once there's no Soviet threat? And Russia's now a weak and benign power allied to the West. But as NATO expanded, it was often claimed in the West that NATO is not anti-Russian. It's not an anti-Russian alliance. Instead, it's a kind of collective security agreement aimed at protecting its members from outside aggression and peaceful mediation of conflicts within the alliance. NATO always had two purposes. One was to contain the Soviet Union, right? And the other was to prevent conflict within itself between Greece and Turkey, Germany and France. And imagine how successful in many ways NATO, the UN, and all that was when you had 3 wars between Germany and France up to the Second World War, and then you have no borders between those two countries today. Kind of an incredible solution to the problem of security in Europe. Recognizing the sovereignty of all states and their right to ally with whatever state they wish, NATO acceded over time to the requests of European democracies to join the alliance, particularly the small states now emancipated from Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. Even though former members of the Soviet-established Warsaw Pact and 3 Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were brought into NATO, the Kremlin was told repeatedly that they should understand and accept that this expansion eastward of NATO onto the borders of Russia in no way presents a threat to Russia's security. The Russians, of course, did not believe that. Now, the opposing narrative to this idea of a benign NATO is that Russia's security concerns are in fact genuine, and the West knew about them. As has been expressed repeatedly, not only by Putin, but by other Russian leaders like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, NATO expansion eastward is seen by Russians as directed against their country. And Putin has been clear that if this continued, it would likely be met with serious resistance by the Russians, even with military action. Russian elite and broad public opinion have both long been opposed to the progressive phases of NATO expansion, as well as other actions by the West, particularly by the United States. For instance, the placement of American rockets in Poland and Romania, which the Americans claim are aimed at Iran. You might think that that would appear absurd to the Kremlin. They are opposed to the arming of Ukraine with Western weaponry. And here's an interesting case. An American political officer in the US Embassy in Moscow reported to Washington in 1995, and I'm quoting, "Hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here," unquote. And then later, when in the late 1990s, President Bill Clinton moved to bring Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO, this same counselor, now for political affairs, wrote that this decision was, and I quote, "premature at best and needlessly provocative at worst," unquote. And he continued, quote, "As Russians stewed in their grievance and sense of disadvantage, a gathering storm of stab-in-the-back theories slowly swirled, leaving a mark on Russia's relations with the West that would linger for decades," unquote. The same officer, now in 2008, at the moment when the George W. Bush administration contemplated inviting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, that officer wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, quote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin To Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I've yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests, unquote. That officer was William J. Burns, then the American ambassador in Moscow, and today Biden's director of the CIA. So the West knew what the Russians thought and feared about NATO expansion. Even a sincere friend of the United States, then President of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, already growing feeble and looking at the world through an alcoholic haze, nevertheless protested the enlargement of NATO, though eventually he was convinced with promises of aid to allow it to happen. It's a wonderful book by a woman named Mary Surratt called Not 1 Inch, which is what Jim Baker told Gorbachev: we will not move NATO 1 inch further east. That goes through all of the story of NATO expansion. If you think about it, these two narratives, one about Russia's essentially expansion and imperial drive, right, based on certain fantasies of what Russia is and can be, and the other based in what Russians think are their security concerns. These two narratives have different outcomes, different upshots, different ways of thinking of how to get out of this conflict. If one holds on to the first, that Russia is essentially imperialist and expansionist, then negotiation and compromise with a determined imperialist will look like appeasement at Munich, one of the most popular analogs to be used in discussing foreign affairs. If you don't know how to condemn somebody, call them Hitler, right? Hitler. My view is the same as John Stewart. The only thing that should be called Hitler is Hitler. The rest of it is muddying the waters. If you accept that view and you try to compromise with Russia, then Joe Biden becomes Neville Chamberlain. But if one accepts the second narrative, that there are real concerns of Russia for its security, then the door is open to discussion, negotiation, compromise, and concessions. But what kinds of concessions and negotiation can take place? That will be the last thing today I talk about. Maybe already it's too late. Maybe there is no way out. But I'm going to try to be optimistic, as I promised. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. In foreign policy, Putin has usually acted like a 19th century realist, unsentimentally and amorally considering the power differentials between states, looking for possible allies ready to take Russia's interests seriously. And recently he found such allies in North Korea and in China. But Putin was also, and made clear that he was willing to resort to armed force when he believes Russia is threatened. And at times, he acted on the basis of his own ideological predilections, which include his fabricated histories of Russia and the Soviet Union, and occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, as last year in invading Ukraine, and as in 2014, his annexation of Crimea after the Maidan Revolution, he's acted rationally, and I would say even irrationally. So he does hold strategic concerns and imperatives, like the fact that there's a Black Sea naval bases at Sevastopol and Crimea is important for defense, as well as a nationalist justification after the fact to bring the imagined cradle of Russian Christianity, namely Crimea, and a historic conquest of the Tsars, including Catherine the Great, back into the fold of the motherland. Now, realists like John Mearsheimer believe that the world is made up of powers who are interested in expanding their power, protecting themselves and expanding their power. This is offensive realism. In other words, for John Mearsheimer, that view of realism is what we can call an ontology. It's the way the world actually works. For me, as a constructivist thinker, I believe that realism is an epistemology. It's the way people think it's the way the world works, right? Which means it can be different as well. And what's really important in this distinction between ontology, that's real, and epistemology, that's what people think is real, is that if enough people think it's real, it gets real. In other words, if everybody thinks like realists and it's all about power, and we've got to stand up to China right now because God knows that if they get enough chips, Huawei and everything will beat us, and in 30 years, we'll be the second-rate power. So if you start thinking that way, then it becomes a reality on which people act. So in other words, for Putin, you've got to consider what threats he really believes in and how his belief in those threats, his perceptions, become a reality, right? Threat itself is an interesting word. Threats are perceptions. They're the way you imagine that you're in danger. And they create anxieties. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a fear of something that isn't really there or doesn't actually appear at the moment. It's a fear of the future. And much of foreign policy is about anxieties, that China will outstrip us, or China will invade Taiwan, which we're making more and more likely every day. So, that kind of thing seems to me has to be taken into consideration. In other words, look at what Russia thinks are its real interests. By the way, there was no threat from Ukraine to Russia in 2022. It just didn't exist. Ukraine was not. But Ukraine was a country in which Americans were training Ukrainians and supplying it with weapons. You could say that Ukraine was not in NATO last year, but NATO was in Ukraine. And Putin knew that and feared what was likely to occur later. Putin's sense of Russia's inferiority and insecurity vis-à-vis a much more powerful NATO, therefore, I believe, is genuine. But during the current impasse over Ukraine, this fear, this threat, this idea has become more fevered and more paranoid. Usually a rationalist, I believe Putin, since the pandemic, has now been consumed by emotion, which is evident in the long screeds on history and his sensitivity at repeated humiliations of Russia by the West. Few in the West actually know that Russia has not expanded in the 20th century. Russia has grown smaller in the 20th century, except for brief periods right before and right after World War II, when Stalin took over parts of Finland and the Baltic countries moved the western borders of Russia westward, etc. The Russian Empire before 1917, before the revolution, included much of Poland, Finland, and parts of eastern Turkey. We consider that Armenia. In the 1940s, Stalin annexed parts of Finland and the Baltic republics and united lands from interwar Poland with Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarus. Actually, Ukraine that we have today was largely made by Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev. Putin is right about that in his histories. Putin himself was actually traumatized by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the shrinking of the country he was born in. He admits this in his memoir. The loss of those events in 1991 of 1/3 of the former territory controlled by Moscow and half of the population. 50 million so-called Russians or Russian speakers were outside of Russia proper. Russia shrank as a state and found itself much weaker and vulnerable to rival great powers. So here was a great multinational country, really an empire, the Soviet Union, which now for the first time in modern history shrank to become ethnically more homogeneous. That is, overwhelmingly a Russian nation state. Russia is more like a nation state today than ever in its history. Less multinational. And that's one of the definitions that usually goes along with empire. Now, one does not have to agree with Putin's vision to understand how Russians feel about their place in the world. I very much am interested myself in emotions in politics. I was in a political science department for 11 years at the University of Chicago, and this political science department, like many American political science departments, believed in something called rational choice theory, that we're all animals of some kind that want to maximize our utilities. That means we act in our own self-interest. It seemed to me a very desiccated view of human behavior, and so I began teaching courses with the agreement of my colleagues on emotions in politics. And emotions play a role. And so you then can examine and try to figure out what are the dominant emotions that Russians express in their press, in the media, in Putin's statements, etc. And what comes to mind are things like resentment. What is resentment? Very powerful emotion. It's when someone else is getting something you think they don't deserve, and you're not getting what you think you deserve. Humiliation, another powerful emotion, along with what I defined as fear without an object, namely anxiety about the future. And you can find that overwhelmingly in the press, on television, etc. As we now see, national leaders who feel cornered and ignored may strike out. Putin has already threatened military and political consequences if the currently neutral states, no longer neutral, Finland and Sweden attempted to join NATO. Well, they're joining NATO. And what has Putin done? Nothing. Okay? The bizarre paradox of the current crisis is that not being in NATO, but expressing a preference to join NATO, endangers small states near Russia, as Georgia learned in 2008. One wonders, as did George F. Kennan, the great father of containment doctrine, who warned against NATO expansion, if the advancement of NATO eastward has actually increased the security of European states, or, as the Ukrainian war seems to argue, made them more vulnerable. Laying the toxic effects of nationalism aside, no reasonable person, I believe, can equate the intentions or morality of the two sides in this Ukrainian-Russian war. One side is an aggressor, the other is the defender. Ukrainians and their supporters see the struggle as an existential one. They are fighting for their existence, their political and national identity. Putin, and by extension Russians, are in the dominant Western discourse, and certainly in the discourse and language of Ukrainians, aiming at the obliteration of the Ukrainian nation, its full integration into Russia. I think this is wrong, and it's a misreading of what Putin has written. As they understand Putin and their supporters of the war, Russia is defending both its position as a great power against the threats of the United States and NATO, and its own national political identity, which gravitates between a benignly imperial self-image with a geopolitically determined leadership role within a concrete sphere of influence, as well as a self-image of a protector of traditional values against the decadent West. Russia has ambitions. It speaks of itself as a new kind of civilization, a rather conservative and xenophobic civilization. And it doesn't have the capacity to realize its own aims. And that's the definition of imperial overreach. A country that has aims that it physically, materially, economically is not able to realize. Now, Russia's not the only power like that. The United States also may be considered a power that is overreaching, right? Because our aim in the world is to be the global hegemon, to be dominant everywhere, not only in Latin America, which we have dominated, but in Europe, in the Middle East. Look, we just sent an aircraft carrier to Israel. and in the South China Sea as well. After all, that sea is named after China, but we're going to dominate there as well. We have global ambitions, and we mean to protect them and continue them, and to prevent China or Russia or any other power to, in fact, knock us off that pedestal. And that is a vision of Putin, very powerfully a vision of Putin. Indeed, he does share elements with Dugin and Eurasianists, a culturally essentialist view of Russia and its treasured civilization, which stands opposed to the liberal, more tolerant, though not neoliberal, because they are in fact neoliberal, values of the West. Given this vision of Putin's ideological and strategic disposition and his affiliation with the philosophical outlook of Dugin, and given Russia's propensity for imperial expansion and their disposition to disrespect and negate the Ukrainians as a nation in the Western discourse, there's no opportunity, at least at the moment, for compromise, negotiation, or agreement with the current Russian regime. So you see how a certain way of understanding the struggle limits our possibilities of ending the struggle. One philosopher, Hans Herbert Kögler, poses the matter clearly, quote, how do you negotiate with someone who aims at your destruction? How do you establish a basis for mutually binding and valid treaties with someone for whom your own status as a subject to negotiate such treaties, namely as a sovereign subject of the state of Ukraine, is the declared target of annihilation, unquote. So here's the dilemma, that the way we describe this struggle, in fact, cripples us in trying to find a way out. If we accept such arguments about the origins of the conflict and Putin's intentions, then negotiation and compromise becomes impossible, and a prolonged annihilistic war continues until one side crushes the other. But what if this analysis is in fact wrong and needs to be modified? And it's possible to show that Russia's aims in the war are more about its own idea of security that does not require the destruction of Ukraine, or that its aims have shifted significantly after its initial grandiose, overreaching intentions were thwarted by Ukraine's effective resistance. If that's so, then there is room for a ceasefire negotiation and some suboptimal solution to the war. And here's what I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes or so. I'm going to give you 10 points that I think will make up my argument. First, when we analyze international affairs and foreign policy, particularly of adversaries, it's essential methodologically that we look beyond the actions of a single power, in this case Russia, and consider the many-sided configuration of the global order. How did Russia perceive this so-called rules-based international system? And what threats it understands from the pre-war constellation of forces? We generally don't do that. We simply think this rules-based order, which was created by the United States and works in the American interest and the West's interest, is the normal way of behavior, and Russia ought to, in fact, agree to that. Whereas Russia is indeed, and has been, a revisionist power, and has sought, since the years of Mikhail Gorbachev, a revised international order. For Gorbachev, it was the elimination of armed blocs. You remember this. The establishment of a single, inclusive system from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was rejected with NATO expansion. But as the NATO alliance expanded eastward, Russia has called for a shift from what it calls a unipolar system dominated by the United States as the global hegemon, to a multilateral system that gives voice to various powers. And by the way, one of the most effective parts of Putin's foreign policy is that this view of multilateralism is becoming increasingly popular, right? Not only China, not only India, South Africa, many countries in Africa and elsewhere are talking positively about this multilateralism and are therefore less sort of antagonistic to Russia's vision than is assumed in Washington. For instance, the BRICS meeting of Brazil and so forth, that meeting, in fact, did push for this multilateralism. And that's an old thing from the time of non-alignment in Cold War years and so forth. Second point, you've got to consider the real world in which a weakened Russia after 1991 found itself, in which a single power, the United States, the architect of this rules-based order, allowed itself the unique right to bend or break those rules when it wished, and to invade a series of countries, most notably Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The United States has caused more deaths outside of its own country since 1945 than any other country on the globe. But we don't recognize that or think about it. Russians, from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin, were displeased by the American promotion of the expansion eastward of NATO and its interventions in Serbia and in Libya. The USA decided to work through NATO, where Russia had no say, instead of the United Nations or the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, where Russia was a member. Russia was dismayed by the American withdrawal unilaterally from a set of arms control agreements. We left, the Americans, in 2001, the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, unilaterally. We left in 2019, the INF Treaty, until there's almost no architecture left of arms control globally. The Russians were the last ones. They pulled out of the conventional arms limitations. So there's almost nothing left internationally on that. And recently, Putin made the threat to increase his nuclear arsenal by testing new weapons. That is, by abandoning the idea of a nuclear test ban. And again, he was simply reverting to a position that the Americans already had. But they had not signed those agreements in any case. Russia had. Of course, they were very upset, besides the things I mentioned, with the invitation to Georgia and Ukraine, two states bordering Russia, into the expanded NATO alliance, as well as I mentioned, the placement of missiles in Poland and Romania, the participation of the West in war games in countries bordering Russia, and the attempt by the United States to prevent the construction and publicly threaten the destruction of the Nord 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany. Putin's Russia, of course, did have a choice. Nothing's inevitable in history. They could have acquiesced in an American-dominated international security system, like, say, Denmark or someplace, and concentrate on its own economic development, as China did during the Deng Xiaoping decades, but no longer. Or if it didn't choose that, to be subordinate to the U.S., it would choose, and did choose, to oppose U.S. unipolarity and contest repeatedly its global dominance. But it did this from a position of colossal weakness. Russia, as Obama said, is a regional power in decline and feels insecure. If countries were able to express emotions, as I mentioned, its dominant feelings would be resentment and humiliation. It feels like and speaks like a victim of Western expansion, and it looks for something that may be too elusive, its own restoration of its lost influence. So a weakened regional power faces a powerful global one and is afraid of losing its sway around the world in the face the U.S. is afraid of losing its sway around the world in the face of its military defeat and retreat from Afghanistan and the economic and potential military threat of China. So there we have the standoff. And this is what the Ukrainian war is largely about, a conflict between two hegemons one regional, the other global, and Ukraine left in the middle as a pawn. The third point, not only did Putin frequently attack America's unique position in the global system, he also made clear the strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia. There's a thing in international affairs called strategic depth. All states want strategic depth between themselves and potential adversaries. We want it. We don't want any foreign powers in the Western Hemisphere. We've blockaded Cuba for half a century, right? And for Russia, they had that strategic depth with the Warsaw Pact and so forth. But now that's gone. And with the war in Ukraine, there's even less than it had been before. In other words, everyone has said this, and I don't have to repeat it. Putin has created a worse situation for Russia than before he invaded on February 24th, 2022. That is, Ukraine is more unified, Ukraine is more anti-Russian, and it's powerfully allied with the most powerful countries in the world. So, if you look at the history of the expansion of NATO and the promises in 2008 to welcome Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, you can see that Russia very aggressively resisted that. A few months after the conference in Bucharest, when George W. Bush got the other powers to agree to invite Georgia and Ukraine, a war broke out between Georgia and Russia. Now, in the dominant narrative, the war in Georgia is a continuum of events, a nice, neat continuum. 2008 in Georgia, Maidan and Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine. But who actually started the war in Georgia? Georgia, not Russia. Where was Putin in August 2008 when Saakashvili, the quite loony president of Georgia, bombed Tskhinvali, the capital of South Ossetia? Putin was in Beijing watching the Summer Olympics with Xi Jinping and was caught off guard and almost lost South Ossetia because they had to get through this Roka tunnel, etc. Once the Russians came into the war and drove the Georgians out and pushed them back and almost took Tbilisi, they decided to stop when the French president intervened and negotiated a settlement. Discussion about the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO subsided for 13 years. It didn't come back. Russia's strategic depth by that time had already shrunk considerably, and Putin, of course, was afraid that it could go further. Putin understands how weak Russia is. And maybe the invasion of Ukraine was a desperate gamble to prevent any further erosion. Until the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and more clearly with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, his foreign policy had actually been quite cautious and realistic, not erratic particularly. He knew he was playing a weak hand. Let me give you some statistics. On the eve of the war in Ukraine, Russia's defense budget was roughly 8% of the American defense budget alone. Never mind NATO as a whole, which was spending 20 times what Russia was spending on defense. Economically, Russia was a declining power. The GDP, gross domestic product, of Russia was about half that of the state of California. This is a petrostate, dependent on exports of gas and oil. It was suffering from sanctions that the West had imposed after Russia's precipitous seizure of Crimea in 2014. And Russians knew well what it meant to be bogged down in a ground war as they had been in Afghanistan for 10 years, and as they were then in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. A full invasion, they should have realized, would be a catastrophe for Russia, unless it were done very quickly, unless it had been successful, taking Kiev, driving out or killing Zelensky, and imposing a puppet government. And yet, and against all expectations, Putin launched this unprovoked invasion to disastrous results, right? And we need to try to explain that. And also, it's not accidental that most people predicted he wouldn't invade, because it didn't make sense, except to him. And we have kinds of explanations of why he did it. Isolation during COVID, not consulting with his experts on Ukraine, and the imbalance that developed in Ukraine after the Maidan events, right? Ukraine was a very interesting country. If you go back to, say, 2014, it was a state that was quite weak. It was a state that was quite divided. It was a state that was quite corrupt, right? And then there were these protests on the Maidan Square. Ukraine was a state where West and East chose different presidents. And sometimes an Eastern, like Yanukovych, would be elected. Russia liked that and worked with that. And sometimes a Western guy would come to power. But there was a kind of odd balance, and the Russians lived with that. Maidan changed that. Almost overnight, with Yanukovych fleeing to Russia, the country swung radically to the West. And a pro-Western government was put into effect. The balance was gone, and Putin reacted, I think, somewhat rashly by seizing Crimea and thereby isolating Russia from the international community. And later, after some months of delay, it took him time to figure this out, he supported the insurrection which had developed in Donbass. So we have an unbalanced equation now, a kind of civil war in Ukraine that was resolved by moving to the other side. That doesn't mean there weren't attempts at negotiation, Minsk I, Minsk II agreements, based on several points that Russia was ready to accept, and which Ukraine too almost accepted a few months after the invasion. Ukrainian neutrality, a federal relationship with Donbass, agreements that, by the way, would have benefited and were acceptable to Russia. But ultimately, this Minsk II agreement, despite European, Russian, and Ukrainian signatures, were never implemented. Russia and Ukraine, working with European partners, tried to lay out a new structure for Russian-Ukrainian relationship, but it never came to fruition. What I think would have worked is what you could call a Finlandization program for Ukraine. That is basically a neutral state which could run its own affairs, but that would be not be a threat in Russia's perception to Russia. The protocol never happened, the agreements never held, and Putin pointedly referred to the Minsk II agreements on the very eve of the invasion in 2022. On that fateful day when he invaded, the idea of hegemony, some hegemony in the former Soviet space, was gone, it failed, and now you have armed imperialism against its neighbor. Of course, it's a difficult thing now to try to compromise, because nationalist feelings are at a heightened level, and if Zelensky agreed to a compromise, he would probably be thrown out of power, if not worse. Similarly, in the US, any concession to Russia by the Biden administration, particularly in an election year, is already being characterized by the Republicans as appeasement. So, in some sense, both Putin and Zelensky and even Biden face hardliners back home who call for even more aggression, more and more efforts, more and more escalation. Now, I'm going on too long, and I'm only on point 5, so I've got to kind of skim ahead. And I'm just going to mention some of the ideological ingredients that I think make up Putin's worldview. First of all, you should understand, point one, or point five, I'll say, is that there's no coherent national identity in Russia. Russia is a country which is conflicted about what it is and what it was historically. And it lost its sense of identity with the end of the Soviet Union. And it's building a society, something capitalist, something supposedly kind of a democracy, but it's floundering around for 3 decades to try to forge an effective national identity. And what Putin decided to land on is a very conservative, xenophobic, anti-Western, anti-liberal, anti-democratic ethno-nationalism based on a kind of jumble of the achievements of medieval Muscovy, the Tsarist Empire, and the victory over fascism in World War II. This muddled, jerry-built nationalism, expressed in bizarre readings of Russia's past and prognoses for its future, has been borrowed piecemeal from elements of Russian Orthodoxy, traditional xenophobia, 19th century Slavophilism, and 20th century Eurasianism of the type articulated by some really loony thinkers, we'll say eclectic thinkers, like Lev Gumilyov and Alexander Dugin. Remember, of course, as everybody reminds us over and over again, that Putin was trained as a Soviet police agent and intelligence officers. And he was a loyal Soviet. He believed in the Soviet ideology. And the KGB of his era, of the Andropov era, was one of the least corrupt and effective and well-organized and disciplined institutions in the late Soviet Union. And what was the late Soviet Union about, particularly after the fall of the 60s? It was about order, peace, stability, right, and slow growth, right? And not people in the streets and no disorder or instabilities. And Putin likes that. He doesn't want people in the street. He is not a populist. And this is one of the reasons he's suspicious of, though not unwilling to work with, if need be, democracies. I believe he drew closer to the church during this period, which provided some of the grounds for this ideology. But we can't really know if this KGB agent and Soviet guy was using the church and orthodoxy instrumentally and opportunistically, or genuinely believed it. I'm very suspect that he suddenly gave up Lenin for Jesus Christ. His own outlook has changed over time, and of course he, like all of us, is influenced by delusionary thinking as he reads and his mind is infected. He certainly has a dark view of the West, and he does believe that Russia is a unique and endangered civilization, and that was part of what led him into this morass of war. 6th point, really briefly, and this is some of the things he's written about. This war, as one Russian sociologist said, is the most senseless of all wars in our history, in Russian history. And it was based on an elaborate ideological and historical account of Ukraine's intimate historic connections to Russia and the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And he wrote this long essay, which many of you have read. And he talked about Little Russia and New Russia, etc. But I think there's a couple of things that should be made on a careful reading of this account, this kind of fantastical history, and not all of it is wrong, by the way. He says the following, point 7. Modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. We know and remember well that it was shaped for a significant part on the lands of historic Russia. And so he negates the agency of Ukrainians in creating their own nation. But inadvertently, in the same essay, he admits that there is a modern Ukrainian nation state. And it's created by the Soviets. The former Soviet patriot now sees that creation as illegitimate, the product of communists. But not all communists, mostly Lenin. He doesn't criticize Stalin. Stalin is, after all, a hero for these right-wing nationalists. To his attacks on the authenticity of a Ukrainian nation unnaturally hostile to Russia, so there can be Ukraine, but it can't be hostile to Russia because we're all brothers and sisters. We come out of the same cauldron. What he does question is the legitimacy of the Ukraine's current international borders, even though both international law and Russian treaties sanction them. The current territory of the Ukrainian state was a product, in his view, of the Soviet Union, Russia's recognition of a territory of Ukraine, incorporation of Russian areas, he would think they're Russian areas, like the Donbass, the annexation of Western Ukraine and Transcarpathia after World War II by the Stalin regime, but he doesn't mention Stalin, and the 1954 gift of Crimea to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev, shifting it from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic. So he's very much against what Lenin did, particularly Lenin's landmine that he planted at the feet of the Soviet Union, namely the right of secession by the Union republics. And he sees himself as protecting Russia and expanding it by the examples of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Now, what's interesting is, point 8, in the same article, he actually concedes that once a people forms a separate nation, that achievement must be recognized. Same article. I'm reading. Of course, some part of a people, in the process of its development, influenced by a number of reasons and historical circumstances, can become aware of itself as a separate nation at a certain moment. How should we treat them? There's only one answer: with respect. You want to, but he goes on, you want to establish a state of your own? You're welcome. But that doesn't mean that the Soviet borders should not be changed. Ukraine should only possess what it possessed before the Soviet Union. In other words, when you leave, take what you brought with you, unquote. By implication then, if the borders are not changed through negotiation, they shall be changed through war. So there is a Ukrainian nation, but the Ukrainian state is an artificial thing created under the Soviets, and its borders can be changed. And that's the effort he's making with this war. So there's a people, narod. Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are all part of this same narod, this Russian world. By the way, Belarus also could be in danger, but Belarus is friendly to Russia, so there are no neo-Nazis running. Because Ukraine is hostile to Russia, he has to explain that in some way. And he creates a complete fiction, namely that Nazis are running the Ukrainian government. This is, of course, totally bizarre. But not Belarus, and no Nazis there. Now, point 9, if he's right about these things, then and that the state of Ukraine is artificial in some sense because it was created by the Soviets. Putin, think of yourself. Who created Russia? Who made the borders of Russia? Why is Bashkiria and Buryatia and Chechnya in Russia? And again, it was Lenin. It was the Soviets. So in other words, you're planting a landmine at the very base of your own state. Right? If Ukraine is artificial, the logical thing is Russia itself is, etc. The final point. You've been very tolerant and very attentive, and I admire you all. As many times throughout its history, Russia's ambitions are outstripping its capacities. Once again, the Kremlin is engaged in an exercise of imperial overreach, this time motivated by a deep sense of insecurity and vulnerability dressed up in the drag of historical mythologies. The slightly open door of possible exit from the battlefield can easily be slammed if the war is conceived as a zero-sum game between Ukraine and Russia, or as an existential struggle between autocracy and democracy. If we think that Russia actually has we can consider some of its security needs, not that we give in to them necessarily, but that we understand why it might feel this way, then we can sit down and begin to talk. Time is not on the side of peace. The rabid bellicose nationalism stirred up by the state and its obsequious media is growing stronger in the Russian public, and many of those opposed to the war have already left the country. But in my view, there is less at stake than the collapse of the international order if the war is brought to an end. But there's also more at stake, escalation to a possible nuclear conflict if the war continues to escalate. So here's the hard part. How do you negotiate with, and how can you make concessions to an aggressor who launched a war without any immediate, meaningful provocation? How do you sit down with a war criminal who committed atrocities that should be judged by an international tribunal and have been characterized, I think mistakenly, as genocidal? These questions are answered with another question. What is the alternative to a ceasefire, negotiations, concessions, and compromise, as distasteful as they may be? There's no winning in this war. There's only more death and destruction. Both sides would benefit from an early ceasefire in place of as a possible temporary solution, and then the tough talks can begin. And I have a possible solution. No one's going to listen to it, but I have a possible solution. Sit down and begin talking. And give Putin what he won so far. Parts of the Donbass and Crimea. Let him consider that a victory, with all the loss of hundreds of thousands of his own citizens. What was he getting? Crimea is already Russia. And it would probably have chosen to go Russia if the plebiscite had been held fairly. Donbass is a completely ruined landscape, which has to be built up now with billions and billions of rubles. Let Putin do that. And by giving that away, you create a more Ukrainian Ukraine, a more consolidated, less divided Ukraine. And what does Ukraine win? Absolute guarantees, now as a member of NATO, officially or unofficially, within the alliance, of protection from any further Russian aggression. So both sides lose and both sides win to some degree. That's the only thing I can think of how we got out of this horrendous present situation. Thank you.
Wow. Wow.
What did you expect?
Well, I guess I sort of could have guessed. Well, questions? Go ahead, Wayne.
You field the questions.
All right.
Yes, would you like a microphone?
Oh, no, that's okay. So if we agree with your suggestion, does that not just, in Putin's mind, mean, okay, I got this much, let me go see how much more I can get?
Why is that not true? Because it was so costly, right? That is, eventually, even Putin, ideologically in his fantasies, realizes that there's a better way to make Russia great, not this way. This is costing too much. And it's unpopular in Russia as well. If you look at polls, it looks like everyone's supporting. Well, it's just not true. Most of what I hear and what I sense is there's discontent with the war, not very strong support, except among some older generation and some fierce types. There's largely indifference, and they want it to end. Because people were not unhappy with the way Russia was developing before 2022. Ties to the West, open to the West, etc. People were living pretty well. So it seems to me that, and here this is somewhat speculative, that he wants to get out of this war, but doesn't know how. And I think probably Zelensky would like to end the war as well, but they can't make concessions. So here I'm suggesting a win-win, lose-lose scenario. It's the best I can do. You call them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Speak
So,
up, please.
okay. So as you said, this war is As you said, this war is senseless, and I was wondering, like, if Russia is suffering economically and is becoming very weak, then why would Putin want to pursue an expansionist policy? Like, why would he prioritize starting a war? Would taking Ukraine help with Russia's economy, or like, do you think it's just a desperate means to maybe reassure the public opinion or the Russian elite that Russia is strong? Do you think it's, or was it to contain the Western influences or the NATO Eastern expansion? And from Russia's standpoint, I guess, what other means could Putin have could he have chosen if he did not choose to start this war?
Right, very good question. It's a very good question. Putin's maximal goal was regime change, right? I mean, trying to take all of Ukraine, a country of 40 or some million people, and controlling it would be, fantastic. But if you have a friendly regime in Kiev, then you could probably do that. And that was probably what they wanted. It's what the Americans wanted in Vietnam. It's what they wanted in Iraq. It's what they wanted with the anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan. None of those things worked, and it didn't work for Putin either, right? So he lost that gamble, and it was a disaster. And so they now have a different strategy, which is fortifying the area that they're going to contain, keeping it, and a war of attrition rather than this war of movement, which they tried and failed at the beginning. So I think he made a terrible blunder. He miscalculated. He misunderstood the situation. There was a sense that Ukrainians were going to rally to his call, etc., that we're all brothers. And so none of that happened. I mean, it was such an incredible error that he made. But now there's a kind of realism that's set in. And I think on the basis of that realism, this is the best we can get, that they may be ready to talk. The only problem I fear is Putin is waiting for something. What do you think he's waiting for? The victory of Donald Trump next year in the presidential election. I hope that's not going to happen. In some polls, Trump is now leading. But that's a calculation that he can make, that I can hold on for another year and a few months and see what happens. So I don't think there's going to be a solution or sitting down to talk for quite a time yet.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this.
No, wait, we need the mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You're good.
Okay, thank you so much for this really wonderful lecture. And I do have a question kind of going back to geopolitics, like the role China played in this. So I remember once the Russia-Ukraine war just broke out, I went to several panels and they were all talking about, kind of some people were condemning how China should play its role better in this conflict and why China didn't like openly condemning what Russia did. Like, what's your opinion on this kind of comments? And also, like, what kind of role do you think China is playing right now during this Russia-Ukraine conflict?
I'm not an expert on China, but I read as much as I can. I talk to people. So I would say there are a couple of things. One, China could not have been happy about this war, right? That is, China wants stability, wants to grow. China's great asset is that it can outperform the West if it's allowed to do that. And the United States wants to prevent that from happening, so we're not going to sell them chips and all the rest of it, right? And so I think China could compete without military threatening anybody and win, and that would be the preferred way that they would act. Now, Xi Jinping, because of his shift in policies and attitudes, has caused tremendous fear on the part of many countries in the South China Sea, the Philippines, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan, etc. So he's not playing that very wisely. China has tried to be positive and restrained in its attitude toward the war. So it put out a 12-point program for peace, right? Which was totally rejected and totally, what would be a good word? It was mocked in the West, not serious. The first point, did you ever read this thing? The first point of China's thing is every sovereign nation and its borders should be respected. Now, that means, what are you doing in Ukraine? That's one point. Of course, it can also mean, don't forget, Taiwan is ours, and you should respect that. So it has but it was a very powerful thing. Everyone forgot it. Second thing, India and China most powerfully, have been the largest strainers of Putin's nuclear saber rattling. Publicly, Modi and Xi Jinping have said, stop doing that. That's unnecessary. In other words, China doesn't want disorder in the world. It'll do well with order in the world, you see? And it doesn't need that war. And it feels provoked by the United States because the United States is provoking it. I mean, literally provoking it, turning a rival or competitor into an enemy. I think it's a silly thing to do. Remember who started this? It was Trump. And now the Biden administration is continuing. Not that China is innocent, by the way. China has been expanding in the South China Sea. It's taking over certain islands and demanding certain land. China, after all, has 8 bases outside of China. 8 bases. 7 of them are in the South China Sea. 1 is outside of that area, in Djibouti. China is a regional hegemon, not a global hegemon. Russia has 28 bases in the world. All of them are in the former Soviet space, except 1. Where is it? Not Djibouti. We got the Chinese in Djibouti. Syria. That's important because they play an important role in Syria. They're protecting Kurds, by the way, and I'm very fond of Kurds since I have a Kurdish, Armenian-American granddaughter. The Americans have hundreds of bases all over the world. That's the world that China and Russia live in. And they're far weaker than the United States and NATO. So we have to, if we want to talk seriously about international affairs, we've got to understand these balances of power. Way in the background.
Just a quick question, and hope. You alluded to the aircraft carriers moving to the Middle East. Do you think that we're at a moment of destabilization, just in terms of these great powers, or the possibility of like World War III or anything like that?
I think this is a very dangerous moment, a very, very dangerous moment. And it was started by Hamas in a kind of horrific way, this kind of random killing and hostage taking, etc. Not that Palestinians have many weapons, right? They can't take over territory of Israel, so they have to use these kind of terroristic tactics, etc. And don't forget, all of this was preceded by almost daily raids into the West Bank. Almost daily, because settlers were attacking villages, etc. A lot of this is not reported, but it is reported in Europe, and I was in Europe, you can say. So, and then what did Biden do? It's an election year after all, right? So he sends his carrier, and he makes this incredible statement, which is all about, we're giving a blank check to Israel, we're defending Israel, no compromise, not a word about Palestine or the horrors. The Americans thought we can solve the Middle East problem and forget the Palestinians. And Hamas, by doing this horrific thing, said, no, we're here. Pay attention. So we don't know where this is going to lead. Right now, it's going to result in several thousand, if not more, Palestinian deaths in the open-air prison, which we call Gaza. It's a terrible thing. Terrible.
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first one is, since you have stated that Russia's imperialism is largely based on Putin's persona itself, and not like a national opinion, do you think that removing of Putin will lead to peace in Ukraine? And if it will it lead to permanent peace, or like just a short break before its next invasion?
The removal of Putin, let's say he dies or they have one of these sambo fights and somebody hits him in the wrong place and he's finished. Probably be good for Russia, by the way, right? If we lose Putin, I think he was, there were times when he was a progressive figure, he's clearly something else right now. That change of government, the change of leader like that, a very powerful leader like that, could in fact change the nature of the elite. There probably would be a kind of civil war or struggle among the oligarchs the power elite, etc. And hopefully, someone more moderate and sensible would emerge. You can't predict anything like that. And he spent a lot of his energies creating this very xenophobic, anti-Western nationalist, right-wing nationalism. So we don't know how powerful that would be. But I don't think it would be a bad thing if we addressed it.
Can I have one more?
Go ahead.
Maybe I missed it, but can you please say one more time why we shouldn't call war in Ukraine again a genocide of Ukrainian people? Because you stated that it isn't, but I didn't hear why.
So I'm in some ways, by default, a scholar of genocide. I wrote a book on the Armenian genocide. And genocide has a very precise meaning. There are fuzzy edges to the UN definition. It's in whole and in part, destroying culture rather than people, etc. But for me, genocide means the mass killing of a people. Not the mass killing of people, but the mass killing of a people, a defined cultural, ethnic, religious group, an ethnicity, a nationality. It might be called ethnocide. So the Holocaust is a genocide. The Armenian genocide of 1915 is a genocide. A state deliberately, intentionally targeted ethnic group, Armenians and Assyrians, Jews, along with communists and other people and so forth. But that's what genocide is. Now, the term has become so powerful, and it's the only term among those terms, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide. It's the only one that requires a state to take action. Therefore, everybody wants the genocide, right? So Ukrainians want a genocide. They actually want two genocides. They want the whole of the war and what's going on now. Azerbaijan claims Armenians caused the genocide. Armenians say everyone's causing genocides against us. So they use it also promiscuously. It's as if, in order to be a real state, you need an army, a navy, an opera house, and a genocide. Right? And that means the whole term of genocide, the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or Rwanda, is cheapened and pulled and stretched. A friend of ours, who will remain nameless, Norman Neymar, said that the Great Purges were a genocide. Really? It's, you can't just redefine it all the time. But the term has gotten, is the ultimate floating signifier. It's floated all out and you can't contain it. And there are people, I have a whole paper on that next time. I love coming here because you're such great people. The term has become so meaningless that it's used popularly. Now, you could use, I don't mind if you use the adjectival form. That what's going on in Ukraine or what happened in Armenia or in Karabakh is genocidal. It's like a genocide. It's not a genocide. Armenia is ethnic cleansing. In Ukraine, there are many things that are quite genocidal, that look that way. A place like Bucha, but there are terms for that. It's a war crime. You know that the invasion of Ukraine, aggression by one state to another, is a war crime. And those are to be punished in some ways. But they don't require, under international law, the active intervention by a state. But if you call it a genocide, we called what happened, it was Colin Powell who did this, and I can't remember which event it was. Probably something in the Balkans, or was it Rwanda, maybe Rwanda. He called it a genocide. By international law, if you've called it a genocide, you have to act. And we didn't act. He said, that's a genocide, but we're not going to do anything about it. Okay? So you see the problems of it. It gets quite complicated. That's a really good question.
So it's like the same as everyone calls everyone Nazi, like neo-Nazi.
Yeah. And Putin is a fascist if he's not a Marxist.
Yeah.
And Trump is the best of all because he says, oh, those people on the left, they're fascists and Marxists. Really? Together? Yeah.
Okay. So if you're saying that in a way the war in Ukraine is basically the way of Putin to restore Russia as a global power, not regional. So why did they let so many failures in their politics and their hegemony? For example, sorry for like sensitive topic, but in Armenia, recently the Russian peacekeepers failed to protect the Artsakh, or sorry, Nagorno-Karabakh, even though like under the ODKB they pledged to defend Armenia.
I wanna
and
hug
also,
that guy,
sorry, and I have a
because
small,
he's bringing up a topic I care about.
and
Oh.
also the like small extension. Like the current events that happen in Israel and Palestine. Do you think that there is certain trace of Russia in there, because the only countries that currently support Hamas are Russia, at least publicly on their propaganda channels, and Iran? Do you, and like for example, countries like Egypt, they closed the borders with Gaza so people can just escape.
I haven't heard or I've seen any evidence of Russian involvement in that. It's even doubtful that Ukraine was operationally involved, but it was interested and would support Hamas, etc., for reasons of geopolitics and tradition, etc. This is the case of Artsakh, or that's what Armenians call Nagorno-Karabakh. There was this enclave of Armenians inside Azerbaijan, which is now gone. Right? And the Russians, who had agreed to protect Artsakh, these Armenians, didn't do it. They sat on their hands. They let the Azerbaijanis come in and ethnically cleanse the area, which is very interesting, because if Russia is an expansionist, imperial state, what are they doing to losing the South Caucasus? The most vulnerable border of Russia is the Caucasian border. Where is at least stable in the Russian Federation? But the North Caucasus, right? Or South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And what country was the most loyal ally of Russia? Armenia. There's still a base, Russian base in Armenia. So, and yet it retreated effectively. And the most effective actors now are Turkey and Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. Will Russia come to Armenia's aid? Well, Putin doesn't like Pashinyan, the democratically elected prime minister of Artsakh, and he did nothing about it. And Azerbaijan, this is so sad and sounds so cynical, Azerbaijan has oil and gas. So just before this ethnic cleansing, Europe signed a treaty with Azerbaijan to bring oil and gas, because they're not getting it from Russia now, to Europe. So these material factors seem to be far more important. The United States, what has it done? It's a defender of democracy against autocracy. Azerbaijan is a dictatorial, sultanistic state run by a family of kleptocrats who were living well and keeping their people, without what they deserve. Armenia was an elected, unstable, feeble democracy. And yet, are there sanctions by the United States against Azerbaijan? Not a whiff, not a thing. They just sit back. So this is why I think I cannot take seriously, and I see as instrumental and opportunistic, this idea that America is defending democracy. We never defended democracy if a dictator was pro-American and capitalist. If they were socialist and pro-Soviet, then we were for democracy and regime change in that country. We're fist bumping with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's a murderer. We know he ordered the murder of Khashoggi. Our allies in the Middle East are repressive states. Bahrain, run by a Sunni monarch of a country that's mostly Shiite. The Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Let's face it, Israel, so-called democracy, has repressed and occupied about 4 million Palestinians for half a century. And it has been able to do that because it gets $3 billion, doesn't even need the $3 billion anymore, from America every year, and America's backing in that area. It's a very faithful ally. So, the world is changing, and I think we are not changing with it, to recognize that if we were faithful to our own ideals, if we actually obeyed our own rule-based international order, the world would be a far better place. But we actually don't do that. We act much more in a kind of narrow conception of self-interest to remain Our main goal is to remain the global hegemon.
This is outing me as being a literature student more than a history student. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like the role that language plays, especially as you talked about Russia as being like a regional hegemon, and like just kind of offhandedly when you're talking about Putin's witnessing of the fall of the Soviet Union, you're like these former, like this loss of Russian states, well, Russian-speaking states, and so there's this complex dynamic where these states that Russia claims to have legitimacy over because they speak Russian are also states that like have their own languages, and like Ukraine specifically, like the idea of Ukrainian as being a Russian dialect and not its own language, like seems like part of how this like legitimization of the Ukrainian people just kind of being like Russians
Little
over
Russians.
there. Yeah, no, like the whole idea of Little Russia. Like, do you think that that's unique to this instance? Do you think that the role of language is always somewhat present with like regional hegemony? Because like you look at the U.S. and we'll kind of go anywhere. We don't care what language people speak. We do not care if they speak English. Like we will do whatever we want. Whereas like the role of language in this specific conflict seems to have like a more prominent role, at least in kind of like the propaganda around it.
I spent most of my career studying the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. And now our Slavic Association theme for this year is what they're calling decolonization. So decolonization now is the hippest thing you can be. We all want to decolonize and pay attention to the non-Russians. Some of us were doing that 50 years ago, but we didn't know what we were, I didn't know we were decolonizing. I thought we were just writing history. Anyway, and what you found was, one of the things that I argued was that Lenin's nationality policy, which was about developing all of these cultures, right, was an extraordinary way of dealing with multinationality. Now, Stalin would Russify that and so on, but they never got rid of that policy. And the result of Lenin's nationality policy ultimately was the creation of non-sovereign nations with all the instruments and institutions of nations, with their own opera house and sometimes genocide, right, whatever you need, within the Soviet Union. And when the center, Gorbachev, committed suicide and destroyed the center, they went off and made independent nations, right? It's a quite extraordinary thing. Those nations, tied to Russian culture and Soviet experience, you can't get rid of history, nevertheless developed their own languages and cultures in contrast to Russia. So yes, this is an area where the lingua franca is still Russian, and when in trouble, people will immigrate to Russia to find work. Tajiks become gardeners, Armenians are, surveyors or whatever. This is what I've seen. But nevertheless, it's still a zone of some kind of culture. The problem is, Russia, since the end of the Soviet Union, is not a model that anyone wants to emulate. They want to be Sweden or America, but not Russia. Because Russia has not built itself up as a democratic, tolerant state, but rather a kleptocratic, dictatorial state, which is not something that ordinary people necessarily aspire to. What gives me hope, and I think I'm going to end, are we doing all good on time?
You're doing really wonderfully.
But I'm going to say this. What gives me hope, and I love the fact that this is such a young audience, no offense meant to us, but, is that if you look around the world and people are out on the street, are they demanding democracy or are they demanding dictatorship? People go out on the street and get shot and still come out again. Look at the women in Iran. Look at, so many things. I mean, we never pay attention to that fact that the Palestinians have peaceful demonstrations. That never makes the news, only if a terrorist or someone blows something up. In other words, there is democratic aspiration. People want competent governments that are responsive and responsible. And they try hard. But elites of various kinds, usually men with guns, take that away from them and establish these more autocratic regimes. But it's that spirit, that thing that I hope America, in its ideological will actually support, right? Hamas was democratically elected in Gaza. And almost immediately, the Israelis said, we are not recognizing, we're not talking to them, they're against us, etc. And so there were ways, if there's a democratic election as in Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood wins, you have to recognize that was democratically elected. No. The US ultimately backed Sisi, one of the most ruthless dictators in modern times. So we're not even, if we were only faithful, this is a great country. And it has wonderful ideals. And everybody would love to, they all want to come here, right? Because it's rich and powerful and so forth. But we have to really be genuinely interested and defend those things. And we don't do that enough.
Well, my cousin Julian used to tell us stories, and then he'd say, and the wolf left Little Red Riding Hood in a pool of blood. Good night, little children. Sweet dreams. So thanks for ending on such a minor note. But we'll have a major applause and a major key. So. Great audience. Thank you. I mean, really, really attentive, and I appreciate it.